Consider the example in the slide. There are no syntax errors in the code, which implies that you must be successfully executing the place SQL block. The select statement in the block retrieves the last name of the employee whose first name is John. The code does not work as expected. You expected the select statement to retrieve only one row, however, it retrieves multiple rows. Such errors that occur at runtime are called exceptions. When an exception occurs, the place SQL block is terminated. You can handle such exceptions in your place SQL block for better application performance. You learned how to write place SQL blocks with a declarative section, beginning with the declare keyword, and an executable section, beginning and ending with the begin and end keywords, respectively. For exception handling, you include another optional section called the exception section. This section begins with the exception keyword. If present, this must be the last section in a place SQL block. An exception is an error in place SQL that is raised during the execution of a block. A block always terminates when place SQL raises an exception, but you can define an exception handler to perform final actions before the block ends. Two methods for raising an exception. An Oracle error occurs and the associated exception is raised automatically. For example, when you execute a select statement in a place SQL block that does not retrieve any rows, an ORA01403 error occurs. These are exceptions raised by the runtime system implicitly. Depending on the business functionality that your program implements, you may have to explicitly raise an exception. You raise an exception explicitly by issuing the raise statement in the block. Two methods of handling exceptions. To handle an exception, you have to anticipate the exception and write code for handling the exception in an exception block. The exception propagates to the host environment when there is no exception handler defined in the place SQL block. Trapping an exception. Include an exception section in your place SQL program to trap exceptions. If an exception is raised in the executable section of a block, processing branches to the corresponding exception handler in the exception section of the block. If an exception is raised in a block that has no exception handler for it, the exception propagates. That is, the exception reproduces itself in successive enclosing blocks until a block has a handler for it. If place SQL successfully handles the exception does not propagate to the enclosing block or to the calling environment. The place SQL block terminates successfully. Propagating an exception. If an exception is raised in the executable section of a block and there is no corresponding exception handler, the place SQL block terminates with failure and the exception is propagated to an enclosing block or to the calling environment. The calling environment can be any application, such as SQL Plus that invokes the place SQL program, which determines the outcome of the exception. Internally defined ORA-N errors, which are implicitly raised by the runtime system. You can explicitly give names to these exceptions and write the corresponding exception blocks. Predefined exceptions declared globally in the package. Standard. They have predefined names such as invalid_cursor, case_not_found. You write an exception block in the executable section with the name of the predefined exception. User-defined error. Exceptions defined by user according to the application context. You have to declare these exceptions and their corresponding names in declare section. You write an exception block based on the name that you used to declare the exception in the declarative section. You can trap any error by including a corresponding handler within the exception handling section of the place SQL block. Each handler consists of a when clause, which specifies an exception name, followed by a sequence of statements to be executed when that exception is raised. You can include any number of handlers within an exception section to handle specific exceptions. However, you cannot have multiple handlers for a single exception. Begin the exception handling section of the block with the exception keyword. Define several exception handlers, each with its own set of actions, for the block. When an exception occurs, place SQL processes only one handler before leaving the block. Place the others clause after all other exception handling clauses. You can have only one others clause. Exceptions cannot appear in assignment or SQL statements. Internally defined exceptions are ORA-N errors. You define exception blocks for internally defined exceptions by using the pragma exception_init function. You declare an exception name and associate it with an internally defined exception in the declarative section. Pragma exception_init associates an exception name with an Oracle error number. This enables you to refer to any internal exception by name and to write a specific handler for it. The example in the slide illustrates the 3 steps in defining an exception block for internally defined exceptions. 1. Declare the name of the exception in the declarative section by using the following syntax. Exception exception. In the syntax, exception is the name of the exception. 2. Associate the declared exception with the standard Oracle Server error number by using the pragma exception underscore init function. Use the following syntax. Pragma exception underscore init, exception, error underscore number. In the syntax, exception is the previously declared exception and error underscore number is a standard Oracle Server error number. 3. Reference the declared exception within the corresponding exception handling routine. Trap a predefined Oracle Server error by referencing its predefined name within the corresponding exception handling routine. When an exception occurs, you can identify the associated error code or error message by using 2 functions. Based on the values of the code or the message, you can decide which subsequent actions to take. SQLCODE returns the Oracle error number for internal exceptions. SQLERRM returns the message associated with the error number. Place SQL enables you to define your own exceptions depending on the requirements of your application. For example, you may prompt a user to enter the age value in a valid range if the user entered an invalid age value. You must define an exception here, which checks on the range of value of age. If the age is not in the valid range, you may raise a user-defined exception. In the syntax, exception underscore name is the name of a predefined or a user-defined exception. Exception underscore name is optional only in an exception handler, where the default is the current exception. Outside an exception handler, you must specify the name of the exception. The block shown in the slide updates the department underscore name of a department. The user supplies the department number and the new name. If the supplied department number does not exist, no rows are updated in the departments table. An exception is raised and a message is printed for the user that an invalid department number was entered. When a sub-block handles an exception, it terminates normally. Control resumes in the enclosing block immediately after the sub-block's end statement. However, if place SQL raises an exception and the current block does not have a handler for that exception, the exception propagates to successive enclosing blocks until it finds a handler. If none of these blocks handles the exception, an unhandled exception is propagated to the host environment. When the exception propagates to an enclosing block, the remaining executable actions in that sub-block are bypassed. Use the raise underscore application underscore error procedure to communicate a predefined exception interactively by returning a non-standard error code and an error message. With raise underscore application underscore error, you can report errors to your application and avoid returning unhandled exceptions.